Winter 1944. The Eastern Front was a frozen hell. Temperatures plunged below -20 degrees Celsius. Artillery fire shook the forests, and snow fell heavy enough to swallow entire divisions. Amid the chaos of one of the bloodiest offensives of the Second World War, a 36-man Soviet reconnaissance platoon slipped into the dense woodlands outside Lviv and vanished. No radio contact, no survivors. No bodies, only silence in the snow. The mission was supposed to be routine, a simple forward patrol through contested ground, tasked with locating German artillery observers believed to be hiding in the tree line. The men were seasoned, some fresh-faced conscripts from the villages along the Volga, others battle-hardened veterans of Kursk and Stalingrad. They were led by Lieutenant Andrei Vasilyev, a decorated officer known for his boldness and unconventional tactics. It was Vasilyev's leadership that made the mission seem straightforward. But nothing about that winter was straightforward. When the platoon failed to report back after 24 hours, Soviet command assumed a communications failure. After 48, they feared an ambush. After 72, the truth became impossible to ignore. They were gone. Search parties combed the forest for weeks. They found boot prints that ended abruptly in a clearing. A single broken rifle sling. A half-buried helmet frozen in ice. But of the 36 men, there was no trace. Not a shell casing, not a body, not even a scrap of uniform. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. Rumors spread quickly through the Red Army's ranks. Some whispered they'd been cut down by a German ambush and buried in a mass grave. Others believed they had defected, gone over to the enemy in a desperate bid for survival. A few claimed they had been silenced by their own, caught in the crossfire of Stalin's paranoia. None of it was ever proven. The platoon was officially listed as missing in action. Unofficially, their disappearance became a ghost story soldiers told over campfires on sleepless nights. For 75 years, the frozen forest held its secret until a team of metal detectorists stumbled across something buried beneath the snow and soil, something that would finally reveal what happened on that bitter January night. To understand how an entire unit could disappear without a trace, you have to understand the world they were sent into. Operation Winter Storm, the Soviet winter offensive of 1944, was not a single battle but a tidal wave, a relentless push westward designed to crush a retreating German army and reclaim the lands of Ukraine. It was a campaign fought in mud and blood, in forests and frozen fields where the line between life and death was measured in minutes. Soviet divisions were advancing on a 1,000-mile front. Whole towns changed hands overnight. One day, a village flew the swastika. The next, the hammer and sickle. Communication lines were severed as quickly as they were established. Maps became obsolete within hours. Commanders planned offensives based on intelligence that was often days out of date, and men died because of it. It was into this chaos that Lieutenant Andrei Vasilyev and his platoon were sent. Vasilyev was 31 years old, the son of a railway worker from Rostov. He had fought at Stalingrad, been wounded twice, and returned to the front with a reputation for bold, sometimes reckless tactics. He believed in speed over caution, initiative over orders. His men trusted him. They called themselves Vasilyev's Wolves, a nod to their leader's reputation for striking from the shadows and vanishing before the enemy could react. Their assignment on January 12th was simple on paper. Infiltrate the pine forest west of Lviv, locate suspected German artillery spotters, and report their positions. The platoon was lightly armed rifles, a few submachine guns, and a single Detectors machine gun. They carried 2 days' worth of rations and a radio set with a range of just 15 kilometers. They were expected back within 36 hours. They never returned. In the confusion of the offensive, their absence barely registered. Dozens of units went missing every week, some annihilated by German counterattacks, others lost to blizzards or encirclement. But this was different. No distress call, no wreckage, no witnesses. As Soviet forces pushed westward, the forest remained behind them, silent and undisturbed, and somewhere beneath its frozen canopy, 36 men had vanished, leaving behind nothing but questions that would linger for 3/4 of a century. The orders arrived at dawn, scrawled in hurried handwriting and delivered by a frostbitten courier who didn't linger long enough to share a cigarette. Lieutenant Vasiliev read them twice, his breath fogging the icy air as he scanned the brief directive. Advance west, scout and secure high ground. Possible enemy observers in the tree line. It sounded routine, the kind of assignment his platoon had completed a dozen times before. But nothing about the 12th of January 1944 was routine. The weather was worsening by the hour, snow falling thick as wool and wind cutting like razors through the pine forest. Reports of scattered German resistance in the area had been vague and contradictory. And there was something else, something Vasiliev couldn't shake. The coordinates they'd been given didn't match the maps. The ridge they were supposed to secure was marked as uninhabited terrain, a no-man's land where neither side had been seen for weeks. Still, orders were orders. By mid-morning, Vasiliev's wolves were on the move. They traveled light, no vehicles, no artillery support, just their rifles and the weight of their mission. The snow was waist-deep in places, the silence broken only by the crunch of boots and the occasional groan of distant artillery. The forest closed around them like a living thing, branches heavy with ice bending low, shadows shifting beneath the pale winter Sunday. At 11:45 a.m., they radioed their position, 1 kilometer from the ridge. It was the last transmission anyone would ever hear from them. Somewhere beyond that point, the platoon vanished. There were no bursts of gunfire over the horizon, no flares lighting the sky. They simply walked into the frozen wilderness and ceased to exist. When they failed to return by nightfall, command assumed a delay. By the next morning they were listed as overdue. After 48 hours, a small search team was assembled. But by then, the ridge had already claimed its secret. The snow fell heavier that night, erasing whatever trace 36 men might have left behind. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed them whole. The search began 3 days after the platoon's disappearance, too late by any reasonable standard. A blizzard had swept through the region, burying the forest under meters of snow and rendering most trails impassable. Artillery thundered constantly in the distance as German forces staged desperate counterattacks, forcing Soviet command to divert manpower to the front lines. What began as a rescue quickly turned into a formality. The first search unit, a detachment of sappers and scouts, combed the edge of the ridge where Vasiliev's men were last heard from. They found only emptiness, no shell casings, no footprints, no signs of a firefight. It was as though the platoon had walked off the face of the earth. A second team pushed deeper into the woods, marking trees and probing snowbanks with bayonets. They found a torn map frozen to the ground and a ration tin half buried beneath a drift. Nothing else. Even the wolves, whose howls had once haunted the night, were gone. On the 5th day, command suspended the operation. Too many men were needed elsewhere. Too many battles raged on too many fronts. Officially, the platoon was now missing in action. Unofficially, they were forgotten. Their families received brief, impersonal telegrams. Your son has gone missing during combat operations. The motherland honors his sacrifice. Some held funerals with empty coffins. Others refused to accept it, writing letters to Moscow that would never be answered. As the war dragged on, the disappearance faded from memory, buried beneath the larger tragedies of the Eastern Front. But the forest remembered. Beneath the snow and silence, something remained, a story that refused to stay buried forever. Time has a way of turning tragedy into legend. In the decades that followed the war, the story of Vasiliev's platoon passed from official reports into whispered conversations, then into the realm of myth. No one ever found their bodies. No one ever explained their disappearance. And so, the vacuum was filled with stories, some plausible, others fantastical. Locals spoke of a German ambush, a well-planned trap that swallowed the men whole before they could radio for help. The theory claimed the platoon had been wiped out in a matter of minutes and buried in a mass grave deep in the forest, their fate hidden beneath decades of moss and snow. Others suggested something darker, that the men had defected, trading their uniforms for civilian clothes and slipping westward into German-occupied territory. In the paranoia of Stalin's Soviet Union, such acts were not unthinkable. Entire families were executed for less. But the most chilling rumor of all was one that refused to die: that the platoon hadn't been lost to the Germans at all, but to their own. Old men in nearby villages spoke quietly of NKVD cleansing operations, secret purges carried out under the guise of discipline. Perhaps Vasilyev had seen something he shouldn't have. Perhaps the platoon had stumbled upon an operation too sensitive to be witnessed. If so, execution swift and unrecorded would have been standard procedure. Then there were the stories that had nothing to do with politics or military logic. Herders spoke of phantom soldiers drifting through the trees on moonless nights, their faces pale, their boots leaving no prints in the snow. Hunters claimed to hear distant Russian voices calling for help from deep within the pines. Even decades later, few dared to enter that stretch of forest after dark. It became known as the Wolves' Wood, a place where compasses spun wildly and birds fell silent. For historians, the debate raged on. Some dismissed the myths as wartime folklore, the natural result of unanswered questions. Others believed the truth was more complex, a convergence of battlefield chaos, political secrecy, and sheer bad luck. But all agreed on one thing: the disappearance of Vasilyev's platoon remained one of the most enduring mysteries of the Eastern Front. 75 years later, the war had long since moved into the pages of history books. The front lines that once roared with artillery were now quiet meadows and overgrown forests. Tourists visited memorials and museums, snapping photos beside rusted tanks and weathered monuments. But beneath the soil, the past was still there waiting. In the spring of 2019, a group of amateur metal detectorists from Lviv set out into those same woods, their goal simple: recover small relics of the war before they were lost forever. They expected the usual finds: a few shell fragments, perhaps a corroded rifle part, maybe even a Soviet badge if they were lucky. Instead, they stumbled upon something far more significant. It began with a faint signal on a hillside where no battles were ever recorded. The ground was uneven, pocked with shallow depressions hidden beneath decades of moss. When they dug, they uncovered a rusted mess tin, then a bayonet. Then, astonishingly, a cluster of Soviet dog tags, 36 of them, all from the same platoon. The men froze, their excitement replaced by a sense of gravity. This was no random scattering of artifacts. This was a sight. Over the following days, they unearthed more: entrenching tools, canteens, fragments of uniform buttons, even a field compass still pointing north. And then came the most haunting discovery: the outline of a trench system no map had ever recorded, buried beneath nearly a meter of earth. It was as if a slice of 1,944 had been sealed in time, untouched and forgotten. The find made headlines across Ukraine, drawing the attention of historians, archaeologists, and eventually the Ministry of Defense. For the first time since the winter of 1944, the story of Vasilyev's platoon was no longer a mystery hidden in whispers and rumors. Something tangible had emerged from the earth, and it hinted at a truth far more complex and far more disturbing than anyone had ever imagined. It started with a single chirp from the metal detector, a faint signal in the cold morning air. One of the hobbyists knelt and began to dig carefully, brushing away the damp earth with his hands. At first, it looked like nothing, a scrap of rusted metal, perhaps another forgotten cartridge casing. But when he wiped it clean, the hammer and sickle emblem appeared. A Soviet infantry badge, its edges corroded by 75 winters, still glinting faintly beneath the dirt. A few meters away, another signal, then another. Within an hour, they had uncovered 3 more badges, all issued to the same unit. This was no random scattering of wartime debris. Something was buried here. The team fanned out, moving slowly and methodically, digging where the detectors sang. Soon they unearthed fragments of leather belts, a buckle still engraved with a serial number, and the remains of a field ration tin stamped with the date: 1944. 943. As the discoveries piled up, a picture began to form. This was not a battlefield, but a position, deliberately constructed and then forgotten. They widened their search radius, probing deeper into the undergrowth. That's when they found it. Just beyond a shallow rise, beneath nearly a meter of compacted soil and rotted leaves, the outline of a trench line began to emerge. Its zigzag pattern followed textbook Soviet defensive doctrine, but no wartime map had ever recorded a position here. The trench was partially collapsed, its walls choked with decades of forest debris, but sections were astonishingly intact, as if abandoned in a hurry and sealed by time itself. Inside, they found pieces of uniform fabric, half-rotted wooden rifle racks, and a rusted mess kettle, still filled with ash from its final fire. Whoever had been here hadn't fled under fire. They had left or been taken with uncanny order. As dusk fell, the team stood silently at the edge of the trench, staring at the frozen scene before them. This was no ordinary discovery. This was the resting place of men whose fate had haunted the region for generations. And the forest, silent for 75 years, was finally beginning to speak. Word of the discovery spread quickly, and within weeks, professional archaeologists and military historians descended on the site. What began as a weekend hobby project became a full-scale excavation, complete with gridded survey maps, documentation teams, and forensic specialists. Each shovel of soil revealed another piece of the story, and each piece raised more questions than it answered. Near the southern edge of the trench, they uncovered a neat stack of Mosin Nagant rifles, their wooden stocks warped with age but still aligned, as if placed there deliberately. Beside them lay a collection of entrenching tools, canteens, and field packs, all arranged with the kind of precision that suggested order, not chaos. Even more curious were the personal effects. Notebooks sealed in wax paper, a tin of cigarettes, a harmonica, and a pocket watch stopped at 1342. None of the items bore damage consistent with combat. There were no shell casings scattered in the soil, no grenade fragments lodged in the trench walls, no shrapnel buried in the earth. Whatever had happened here, it hadn't been a firefight. It was as if the platoon had paused their work, carefully set down their weapons, and simply vanished. Then came the most chilling discovery of all. Near the northern end of the site, in a shallow depression that might once have been a command post, archaeologists found a cluster of personal identification tags, 36 in total, one for each member of Vasilyev's platoon. They weren't scattered, they were stacked neatly, wrapped in a strip of cloth, and buried just below the surface. It was a ritual gesture or a message. Soldiers don't surrender their tags unless forced. Soldiers don't stack their rifles unless ordered. Standing in that forgotten trench, one thing became clear. Vasilyev's men hadn't fallen in battle. They had laid down their arms willingly or under duress and walked away from this place alive. Where they went and why remained a mystery. But for the first time in 75 years, the silence surrounding their fate had been broken, replaced by the chilling possibility that what happened next was far more deliberate than anyone had ever imagined. It was a junior archaeologist who found a rusted tin box wedged beneath a rotted floorboard in what had once been a dugout near the center of the trench. At first, they assumed it held rations or spare ammunition. But when the lid finally pried open with a groan of metal, the team froze. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, blackened by age, was a small, leather-bound notebook. Faded Cyrillic letters were embossed on the cover. Lieutenant Andrei Vasilyev. Against all odds, the field journal had survived. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, but the ink was legible, a first-hand account of the platoon's final days. The early entries were mundane: supply tallies, terrain sketches, routine patrol notes. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted. Words like strange and unsettling appeared more frequently. One entry mentioned intermittent radio interference, bursts of static that drowned out commands and rendered their transmitter useless. Another spoke of movement in the tree line at dusk, shadows that vanished when challenged, footsteps that seemed to circle their position without ever revealing themselves. Vasilyev recorded his growing unease with the mission itself. The coordinates they'd been given didn't align with the intelligence briefings he'd received a week earlier. Patrol routes were altered without explanation. "Either someone made a mistake," he wrote, "or we are being sent somewhere deliberately." His men were becoming restless. One report detailed a sentry insisting he saw figures watching from the tree line, not Germans, but men in long Soviet greatcoats. Vasilyev dismissed it as nerves, but the detail recurred again and again. And then there was the final entry, written in hurried, almost illegible script. "We are being watched. I fear this mission is not what it seems. If this is my last entry, let it be known we followed orders. Whatever happens now is beyond our control." The next page was blank. The journal ended there, no record of their final hours, no clue as to where they went after that last desperate note. But it changed everything. This was no simple reconnaissance mission gone wrong. Whatever happened in those woods had been foreseen and feared by the man leading the platoon. The discovery of the journal might have been the most haunting moment of the investigation, if not for what came next. Roughly 300 meters south of the trench, a team surveying with ground-penetrating radar detected a dense anomaly beneath the forest floor. At first, they thought it might be a collapsed bunker. But when the first shovel struck bone, the truth became horrifyingly clear. It was a mass grave. The pit contained the remains of 27 men, most still wearing remnants of Red Army uniforms. Their wrists were bound behind their backs with lengths of twisted field wire. Every skull bore the same signature, a single bullet wound to the base of the skull, execution style. Forensic analysis confirmed the unimaginable. These men hadn't died in combat. They had been lined up and shot. Stranger still were the shell casings scattered throughout the site. Some were German 7.92 mm Mauser rounds, standard issue for Wehrmacht rifles. Others were 7.62 x 5.4 mm Soviet ammunition. Two enemies' weapons fired in the same place, at the same time. The implications were staggering. Either the platoon had been captured by German forces and executed, and then their captors had been ambushed by Soviet troops in the same location, or something far darker had unfolded. Some historians began to suspect a third possibility, an NKVD purge, disguised as a battlefield incident. During the chaos of the Eastern Front, Soviet secret police had executed thousands of their own soldiers for perceived cowardice, disloyalty, or political unreliability. If Vasilyev or his men had seen something they were not meant to see, or if their disappearance itself was part of a larger deception, such an execution would fit the grim logic of the era. But the presence of German casings complicated that theory. Had a firefight occurred before the execution? Had the NKVD used captured weapons to stage a false engagement? Or were both sides, for reasons lost to time, complicit in the massacre? No definitive answer emerged. All that was certain was this: 27 men of Vasilyev's platoon had not died as heroes in battle. They had been executed, their story erased, and their graves swallowed by the forest. And 9 others, including Vasilyev himself, were still unaccounted for. The mass grave should have been the end of the mystery, but in many ways it was only the beginning. As news of the discovery spread, historians and journalists turned their attention to Moscow's long-sealed wartime archives, hoping that somewhere in the labyrinth of Soviet bureaucracy lay the missing pieces of the puzzle. What they found only deepened the intrigue. A series of documents, quietly declassified in the mid-2000s, referenced an unsanctioned encounter near Lviv in January 1944. The language was deliberately vague, but the details were unmistakable. A Soviet reconnaissance unit designation and number redacted had interfered with the relocation of a Category 1-2 element. That phrase, historians believe, was code for a penal battalion or a detachment of defecting Soviet soldiers being transferred under NKVD guard. Such units were among the regime's darkest secrets: disgraced soldiers, political prisoners, or captured partisans forced into suicidal missions to atone for their crimes. If Vasiliev's platoon had stumbled upon such an operation, it would have been catastrophic for the Soviet command. Exposure risked revealing not just the existence of these units, but the brutal policies underpinning them. The documents hint that the matter was resolved in the field, a euphemism that, in NKVD reports, almost always meant one thing: elimination. Yet even this explanation failed to account for all the evidence. Across the border, recently digitized Wehrmacht intelligence reports from the same week told of a confusing firefight between two Soviet elements near the Dniester River, a skirmish so violent and inexplicable that German observers initially believed a DOP's Red Army mutiny was underway. The coordinates matched almost exactly the area where Vasiliev's platoon vanished. The implication was staggering. Two Soviet units had clashed with each other in the forest, whether by accident, misunderstanding, or deliberate intent. And if the NKVD had indeed been present, their involvement might explain the execution site, the mixed shell casings, and the total absence of official Soviet records. Both sides, Soviet and German, seemed to know more than they were ever willing to admit. And somewhere in the tangled mess of propaganda, secrecy, and post-war denial, the truth about what happened to Vasiliev's men had been buried not once, but twice. 75 years after 36 men marched into the forest and vanished, they finally came home. In a solemn ceremony beneath the same pines that had concealed their fate for decades, the remains of the platoon were laid to rest with full military honors. Red Army banners rippled in the wind as a brass band played the mournful strains of the Sacred War. Old veterans, their medals glinting in the pale Ukrainian sunlight, stood shoulder to shoulder with young cadets barely older than the men who had died there. Families who had spent their lives with only questions now had somewhere to grieve. Some wept quietly as they placed flowers on simple wooden coffins. Others stared silently at the names carved into the memorial stone, names once scrubbed from records, now etched back into history where they belonged. Historians spoke of sacrifice and duty, of men caught in a storm far larger than themselves. Soldiers saluted, priests prayed, and as dusk settled over the clearing, a hush fell over the crowd, a silence deeper and more powerful than any words. The story of Vasiliev's platoon had begun as a footnote, a mystery dismissed by bureaucrats and forgotten by time, but now, after decades of silence, it had become something more, a lesson. Their disappearance was no longer just a tale of men lost in war. It was a reminder that history is often written in the spaces between what we know and what we are allowed to know. It showed how fear, secrecy, and shame can erase even the bravest from the record, and how truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of clawing its way back to the surface. In the end, the story of the vanished platoon was not about victory or defeat. It was about memory, the fragile thread that binds the living to the dead, because not all battles are fought with rifles and artillery. Some are fought against silence, against secrets, and against the relentless passage of time. And in that fight, after 75 long years, Vasiliev's men had finally won. This video was intense, but this video on the right-hand side is even more insane.